Chapter 1, The Contract of Desperation. The Manhattan skyline was a jagged crown of glass and gold, but inside the penthouse of the Harrison Vance law firm, the air felt like a tomb. Jack Harrison, a man whose rugged American charm was currently buried under a layer of cynical exhaustion, stared at the document on the table. He was 34, with the kind of broad-shouldered presence that commanded a room, but his eyes, a deep, restless amber, showed the toll of a family legacy that was currently crumbling into dust. Across from him sat Elena Vance. She was breathtaking in a way that felt dangerous, sharp cheekbones, hair the color of midnight, and a gaze that could wither a board of directors in seconds. But beneath her designer armor, Elena was drowning. Her father's tech empire had been hollowed out by a silent embezzler, and Jack's family firm was the only entity with the forensic power to find the culprit before the feds knocked on her door. "This is insane, even for our families," Jack said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Insanity is a luxury we can't afford, Jack," Elena countered, her voice steady despite the tremble in her heart. "The merger fails if we don't present a united front. The investors don't want a partnership. They want a dynasty. And the board won't approve the audit unless we are legally bound. The 7-day experiment. According to the archaic bylaws of their grandfather's original agreement, if the two heirs married, they had to complete a cohabitation assessment to prove the union wasn't a sham for tax evasion. 7 days of living in a secluded estate, monitored by a court-appointed mediator, with no contact with the outside world. If they failed to show genuine domestic synergy, by the end of the week, the merger would be voided, the firm would be liquidated, and Elena's family would face a public, ruinous scandal. 7 days, Jack repeated, a bitter smile playing on his lips. 7 days to pretend I don't remember why we stopped speaking 10 years ago. 7 days to act like this is a romance and not a ransom note. We don't have to love each other, Jack, Elena said, leaning forward until he could smell the faint, intoxicating scent of jasmine and steel. We just have to survive each other. 1 week of your life to save everything our parents built. Can you put your pride in a box for 7 days? Jack looked at the pen, then at the woman who had been his greatest rival and his first, secret heartbreak. The stakes were realistic and devastating: total financial ruin or a week of forced intimacy with the one person who knew exactly how to break him. He signed his name in a bold, aggressive stroke. "Pack your bags, Elena. Let's go give them the show of a lifetime." As they stood up, the tension in the room snapped like a high-tension wire. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a collision. They were two beautiful, broken Americans trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, and the clock had just started ticking. Chapter 2, Day 1, The Silent Wall. The Harrison estate sat on a jagged finger of land in Newport, Rhode Island, a sprawling stone fortress draped in ivy and salt spray. It was a relic of a time when money was meant to be seen and felt. As the heavy oak doors groaned shut behind them, the court-appointed mediator, a stern, humorless man named Mr. Henderson, handed them a single set of keys and a list of expectations. For the next 168 hours, Henderson announced, his voice echoing in the cold marble foyer, you will share this space. No staff. No phones. No distractions. I will be in the guest cottage at the edge of the property. I expect to see progress, not just presence. When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed was heavier than the storm clouds gathering over the Atlantic. Jack dropped his leather duffel on the floor, the sound booming like a gunshot. "The master suite is upstairs," Jack said, not looking at her. "I'll take the dressing room sofa. You can have the bed." "No," Elena replied, her voice sharp. She was standing by the tall windows, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. "The expectations were clear, Jack. Synergy. If Henderson looks through the window or does a surprise check and sees us living like roommates in a hostel, the audit is dead by morning. We share the room. We share the bed. The conflict was immediate. To Elena, this was a tactical maneuver. To Jack, it was a slow-acting poison. They climbed the grand staircase in a rhythmic, agonizing sync, their shadows stretching long against the mahogany walls. The master suite was a cavern of velvet and moonlight. The air smelled of cedar and something else, the faint, lingering scent of Jack's mother's perfume, a reminder of the tragedy that had hollowed this house out years ago. "I forgot how much this house feels like a museum," Elena whispered, her guard dropping for a split second. "It's not a museum," Jack snapped, pulling his shirt over his head, revealing the rugged, hard-won muscle of a man who worked off his stress in the gym. "It's a graveyard. My father died in that study. My brother left through that front door and never looked back. Don't try to make this cozy, Elena." The tension shifted from business to something visceral. Elena turned away, her face flushing as she began to unarchive her own suitcase. Every movement was tracked by the other. The forbidden nature of their history, the summer 10 years ago when they were just two kids from rival families who thought they could change the world, hung between them like a physical barrier. As night fell, the silent wall became literal. They lay in the massive four-poster bed, feet apart, staring at the ceiling. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of two people terrified to touch, yet forced to be within reaching distance. "Jack," Elena whispered into the dark. "Go to sleep, Elena. We used to be able to talk for hours. That was before your father's company tried to sue mine into bankruptcy." Jack's voice was like gravel. "The clock is ticking. Don't waste your breath on the past." Day one ended not with a spark, but with a deepening chill. They were physically closer than they had been in a decade, yet the chasm between them had never felt wider. The experiment was working, it was exposing exactly how much they had lost. Chapter 3, Day 2, The Ghost in the Room. Day 2 began with the relentless gray light of a Rhode Island morning. The experiment required them to prepare a meal together, a test of domestic coordination. But as they moved around the cavernous, industrial kitchen, the air was thick with the clatter of silverware and the unspoken accusations of a decade. "You're doing it wrong," Jack muttered, his hand reaching over hers to adjust the flame on the vintage stove. His skin brushed against hers, and for a second, the world stopped. Elena didn't pull away immediately. The heat of him was a jarring contrast to the cold marble of the estate. "I'm not a child, Jack," she snapped, though her breath hitched. "I've been running a tech conglomerate while you were playing the brooding recluse in your law firm." Running it? Or watching it burn? The jab hit home. Elena's eyes flashed with a tragic fire. "My father is sick, Jack. He wasn't embezzling, he was losing his mind. He made mistakes because he couldn't remember the passwords to his own life. I did what I had to do to protect him." The revelation stunned Jack into silence. The ghost in the room wasn't just their failed romance, it was the hidden frailty of the giants who had built their worlds. To settle his nerves, Jack retreated to the one place he was told was off-limits, the attic archives. Elena followed, unwilling to let him out of her sight. Among the dust-covered crates of the Harrison Vance legacy, they found a locked cedar chest. Jack broke the seal, and inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a tattered blue ribbon. As they read, the realistic foundation of their hatred crumbled. The letters weren't business memos. They were correspondence between Jack's mother and Elena's father from 30 years ago. "The merger isn't for the money, Elias. It's to keep us together. Our spouses will never understand, but the firm is the only bridge we have left." They were in love, Elena whispered, her fingers trembling as she held the parchment. "Our parents didn't hate each other. They were having an affair." And when my father found out, Jack added, his voice hollow, he didn't just sue your family. He destroyed the merger to punish her. He burned both families to the ground because he was a jealous man. The twist was sickeningly clear. The forbidden nature of their family's rivalry was built on a foundation of betrayal and heartbreak that had nothing to do with them. They were the collateral damage of a war fought by ghosts. We've been hating each other for a lie, Jack, Elena said, looking up at him. The attic was small, the ceiling low, forcing them into a forced proximity that felt more intimate than the bed they had shared. Jack reached out, his thumb grazing a tear that had escaped Elena's eye. The conflict shifted. The enemy wasn't the person standing in front of him, it was the legacy they were both trying to save. 7 days isn't enough to fix this, Jack said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, soft register. Then we make every minute count as the sound of Mr. Henderson's footsteps echoes on the stairs below. They quickly hid the letters, but the damage was done. The ghost was out of the closet, and the wall between them didn't just have cracks, it was beginning to fall. Chapter 4, Day 3, The Breaking Point. The dawn of the third day was shattered by a frantic pounding on the heavy oak front door. It wasn't the stoic Mr. Henderson. It was a courier, drenched in a sudden Newport rain, clutching a crimson-sealed envelope. Jack snatched the document, his eyes scanning the legalese with the precision of a predator. His jaw tightened until the bone threatened to snap. An emergency injunction, he rasped. The board of directors isn't waiting for the 7 days. They've filed for an immediate freeze on all Harrison Vance assets, citing instability in leadership. They're moving to liquidate the firm by noon tomorrow. They can't do that, Elena gasped, her face turning a ghostly pale. The experiment is legally binding. It's only binding if the heirs are compliant, Jack countered, pacing the foyer like a caged lion. They're claiming I'm mentally unfit to lead because I agreed to this theatrical marriage. They're using our history against us, Elena. They're calling this a sham to the press as we speak. The tragedy was unfolding in real time. Their families' legacies weren't just at risk, they were being actively dismantled by the very people they were trying to save. The suspense hit a fever pitch when Elena's tablet, which she had smuggled in against the rules, chirped with a notification. Jack, look. It's a leak from the firm's internal server. Someone didn't just file an injunction. They've altered the forensic audit logs. They're framing us for the embezzlement my father was accused of. The conflict had shifted from emotional to existential. They weren't just fighting for a merger, they were fighting to stay out of federal prison. We have to leave, Jack decided, his eyes burning with a new, fierce light. The only person who can verify the original logs is Marcus Thorne, the lead auditor who went into retirement the day after the merger was announced. He's hiding out at a hunting lodge 3 hours north. If we leave, we fail the experiment, Elena reminded him, pointing toward the guest cottage where Henderson was surely watching. Henderson will report a breach of contract the second my heels hit the gravel. Then we don't use the gravel, Jack said, a dark, daring glint in his eyes. Jack led Elena through the servants' passage, a narrow, claustrophobic stone tunnel that led from the cellar to the old boathouse on the cliffside. The air was damp and smelled of earth and ancient secrets. As they squeezed through the final doorway, the roar of the Atlantic met them. Jack pulled the tarp off a vintage, high-powered speedboat, the SS Aurora, the same boat from the letters they had found. "Get in," he commanded. As the engine roared to life, a searchlight from the estate swept over the water. Henderson had noticed. The breaking point had been reached. They were now fugitives from their own lives, racing across a black, churning sea toward a truth that could either set them free or sink them both. The boat hitting a massive swell, the salt spray soaking them both as Jack steers with one hand and pulls Elena close with the other. The forced marriage was no longer an experiment, it was a partnership born in the heart of a storm. Chapter 5, Day 4, The Mask Slips. The hurricane didn't just arrive, it laid siege to the Maine coastline. By the time Jack steered the SS Aurora into a hidden cove near the auditor's coordinates, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. They reached the hunting lodge, a rustic, one-room cabin built of heavy pine and fieldstone, only to find it empty. Marcus Thorne had vanished, likely tipped off by the same people who had filed the injunction. As the first trees began to snap in the gale outside, Jack barred the door with a heavy wooden beam. The power was out. The only light came from the violent flashes of lightning that turned the world white every few seconds. "We're trapped," Elena said, her voice small against the roar of the wind. She was shivering, her silk blouse plastered to her skin from the spray of the ocean. Jack didn't answer immediately. He was busy kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a flame from damp kindling. As the fire finally took hold, casting long, dancing shadows across the room, he turned to her. The mask he had worn for 10 years, the mask of the grumpy heir, who hated her, was finally beginning to crack. "Take off the wet clothes, Elena. Hypothermia doesn't care about your dignity." He threw her his dry flannel shirt. For the first time, the forced marriage felt stripped of its corporate artifice. In the glow of the fire, they weren't the CEOs of rival empires, they were just two people terrified of losing the only thing they had left, each other. "Why did you really come with me?" Jack asked, his voice low, matching the crackle of the wood. "You could have stayed. You could have blamed the escape on me and saved your own reputation." Elena sat on the rug by the fire, the oversized shirt swallowed her frame. She looked at her hands, the gold wedding band from the experiment glinting in the light. "Because I'm tired of being alone, Jack. In that boardroom, in my father's house, it's all just empty space. When I'm with you, even when we're fighting, I feel like I'm actually standing on solid ground." The vulnerability was the breaking point they hadn't expected. Jack sat beside her, the heat from his body more intense than the fire. "I never hated you," he confessed, the words sounding like a heavy weight being dropped. "I hated that I couldn't stop thinking about you. I hated that every time I looked at a contract, I saw your name. I built that wall because I knew if I let you in, I'd never be able to push you out again." The steamy tension that had been building for 4 days finally broke. It wasn't a calculated move or a part of the experiment, it was an act of desperation. Jack reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt and truth. In that one-room cabin, with the world literally screaming outside, they finally found the synergy the mediator had demanded. But it was forbidden, not by law, but by the tragedy of their situation. They were falling in love just as their lives were being dismantled. As they lay together on a pile of wool blankets, the storm outside reached its peak. But the real twist came just before dawn. As the wind died down, Elena noticed a small, blinking light beneath the floorboards near the hearth. She reached down and pulled up a loose plank. It wasn't Marcus Thorne they had found. It was his briefcase. Locked with a biometric scanner, and a handwritten note pinned to the top, "If you're reading this, Jack, you're either the smartest man I know or the most desperate. The truth about the embezzlement isn't in the files. It's in the marriage license." The chapter ends with Jack and Elena staring at the briefcase. The mask was gone, but a new, more terrifying mystery had taken its place. Chapter 6, Day 5, The Forbidden Truth. The morning after the storm brought a deceptive, crystalline peace to the Maine woods. Inside the cabin, however, the air was brittle. Jack spent 3 hours using a portable bypass kit from the boat to crack the biometric seal on Marcus Thorne's briefcase. When it finally clicked open, it didn't contain ledgers or bank statements. It contained a single, original copy of their marriage contract, the one they had signed on day one, and a digital recorder. Elena sat on the edge of the rough-hewn bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jack pressed play. Jack, Elena, Thorne's voice crackled through the small speaker, sounding weary and haunted. If you found this, the board has likely already moved against you. You think you're in a 7-day experiment to save your companies. You aren't. You're in it to lose them. The twist was a physical blow. Thorne explained that the 7-day experiment wasn't a test of synergy. It was a legal trap designed by Arthur Sterling and Elias Vance years ago. The contract they signed contained a poison pill clause hidden in the fine print of the cohabitation section. By leaving the estate on day 3, they hadn't just breached the experiment, they had triggered an automatic forfeiture of all voting shares to a third-party holding company. Who owns the holding company? Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Jack scrolled through the digital files Thorne had provided. His face turned to stone. It's not Marcus Vane or some rival firm. The holding company is owned by a trust. Our parents' trust. The Forbidden Truth was a masterpiece of tragic manipulation. Their parents hadn't just had an affair, they had been planning to merge the companies and disappear together decades ago. When that failed, they set up a system to ensure their children would be forced to finish what they started, or lose everything. But the trust had been hijacked. The trustee, Jack said, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. The person who actually controls the shares once we fail, it's Henderson. The court-appointed mediator wasn't an impartial observer. He was the architect of the collapse, working with a shadow faction of the board to strip the heirs of their power while they were distracted by their forced romance. He sent us here to fail, Elena realized, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and betrayal. He knew we couldn't stay in that house with our history. He knew the board would file that injunction to provoke us into leaving. We played right into his hands. The conflict was now internal and external. They had found the synergy the experiment demanded, but that very connection was the distraction Henderson needed to rob them blind. We have 2 days left, Jack said, standing up and grabbing his coat. Technically, the forfeiture doesn't finalize until the clock hits 0 on day 7. Henderson thinks we're hiding. He doesn't know we have Thorne's keys. What are we going to do? We're going back, Jack said, looking at her with an intensity that made the room feel small again. But not to the estate. We're going to the shareholders' meeting in Manhattan. If we're going to lose everything, we're going to do it while exposing the man who tried to play us like chess pieces. As they prepared to leave the cabin, the forbidden tension flared once more. They had shared a night of truth, but now they had to share a war. The experiment was over, the fight for their lives had begun. Chapter 7, Day 6, The Steamy Descent. Manhattan felt different from the window of a discreet, high-rise safe house. Usually, the city was their playground, tonight, it was a battlefield. They had managed to slip back into the city under the cover of the lingering storm, avoiding the main roads where Henderson's hired security was likely patrolling. The safe house was a stark, minimalist loft in Tribeca, cold steel, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a single, expansive leather sofa. There were no ghosts of parents here, no ivy-covered walls. There was only the hum of the city and the ticking of the clock. They had less than 24 hours before the shareholders' meeting. I've sent the encrypted files to my most trusted analyst, Jack said, his tie long gone, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. But Henderson has the banks in his pocket. Even with the truth, we're walking into a den of wolves. Elena was standing by the glass, looking out at the sea of lights. She had changed into a simple, form-fitting black dress she'd found in the safe house's emergency wardrobe. She looked like a shadow against the neon glow of the city. If we lose tomorrow, Jack, what happens to us? She asked, her voice reflecting in the glass. The marriage was the experiment. If the company is gone, the contract is void. We go back to being strangers. Jack crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't stop until he was inches behind her. He didn't touch her, but the forced proximity of the last 6 days had made his presence a physical weight she could feel in her bones. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl near her ear. "To go back to hating me from across a boardroom?" Elena turned around, her breath hitching. The conflict was no longer about the shares or Henderson. It was about the 7 days that had stripped away a decade of lies. "You know I can't do that. I don't even remember who I was before this week." The steamy descent wasn't a slow fall, it was a plunge. Jack reached out, his hands sliding into her hair, tilting her face up to his. The kiss was no longer desperate or exploratory, it was a claim. It was the sound of 2 lives colliding in the dark before a final battle. They moved from the glass to the leather sofa, the friction of the week exploding into a passion that was as realistic as it was intense. In the middle of the forbidden chaos, they found a sanctuary in each other. Every touch was a rebellion against the parents who had manipulated them and the man who tried to steal their future. As they lay together in the quiet aftermath, the city lights flickering against the ceiling, the tragedy of their situation remained. They were more united than they had ever been, yet they were technically unfit by the rules of the world they were trying to save. "Day 7 starts in 4 hours, Jack whispered, his arm draped over her, pulling her close. "Then let's not sleep," Elena replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I want to remember exactly what I'm fighting for when we walk into that room." The chapter ends with the sun beginning to bleed over the East River, the start of the final day. They were exhausted, they were targeted, and they were likely outgunned. But as they stood up to dress for the reckoning, they weren't the heirs of rival families anymore. They were a team. And Henderson had no idea that the experiment had actually worked, just not in the way he had planned. Chapter 8, Day 7, The Final Choice. The 70th floor of the Harrison Vane Plaza was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the metallic tang of anxiety. As Jack and Elena stepped off the elevator, the sea of shareholders parted like they were seeing ghosts. They were rumpled, their eyes shadowed by a lack of sleep, but they moved with a synchronized purpose that radiated a synergy no mediator could manufacture. At the head of the conference table sat Mr. Henderson. He didn't look like a stern mediator anymore, he looked like a kingmaker. Beside him sat a row of stone-faced lawyers holding the forfeiture papers. "You're late," Henderson said, checking his watch with a predatory smile. "The clock hit 0 10 minutes ago. By the terms of the 7-day experiment, your absence from the estate and your failure to maintain a domestic baseline has triggered the immediate transfer of all voting power to the holding trust." "The trust you control," Jack countered, his voice booming in the quiet room. He tossed Marcus Thorne's digital drive onto the table. "We know about the poison pill, Henderson. We know you've been manipulating the audit logs to force a liquidation." The shareholders began to murmur, the conflict rippling through the room. But Henderson didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, handwritten document. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed. "You think this is about money?" Henderson asked, his voice dropping into a chilling, tragic register. "I was your father's personal attorney for 30 years, Jack. I watched him wither away because of the forbidden secret your family's kept. This isn't a theft. It's an execution of a final wish." He turned the paper around. It was a letter from Jack's father, written weeks before his death. "If my son ever finds the truth about the affair, he will destroy himself trying to fix it. Henderson, if the children ever try to merge the companies, you must stop them. The blood of these 2 families cannot mix. The liability is too high. The twist was a gut punch. Henderson wasn't just stealing the company. He was acting on a dead man's vengeful, paranoid command to keep the families apart forever. The final choice is simple, Henderson sneered. Sign the dissolution of marriage right now, admit the experiment was a fraud, and I will allow you to keep your personal trust funds. You can walk away wealthy, but separate. Or, you fight this, the feds move in on the embezzlement charges I've laid for you, and you both go to prison with nothing but each other. The room went silent. The tragedy was absolute. To save their freedom and their fortunes, they had to destroy the one thing they had finally found, the truth of their love. Jack looked at the dissolution papers. He looked at the room full of people waiting to see him break. Then, he looked at Elena. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her chin was tilted in that same defiant way that had first captured his heart 10 years ago. The money doesn't matter, does it? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Not a cent, Jack replied. In a move that stunned the board, Jack didn't pick up the pen to sign the dissolution. Instead, he took the original marriage contract, the one Henderson claimed was their cage, and ripped it in half. We aren't staying married because of a contract, Henderson, Jack said, his voice echoing with a new, terrifying authority. And we aren't leaving this room because you told us to. You want to call the feds? Call them. Because while they're investigating us, they're going to find the offshore accounts we traced back to your name last night in Tribeca. The final choice had been made. They chose each other over the empire, but in doing so, they had finally found the leverage to tear Henderson's house of cards down. Chapter 9, The Reckoning. The boardroom transformed into a war room in an instant. As Jack's accusation hung in the air, the double doors at the back of the hall burst open. It wasn't the private security Henderson expected, it was the FBI. Leading the charge was Special Agent Miller, a man with a face like flint who had been tracking the Harrison vein embezzlement for months. Nobody moves, Miller commanded. We're here for the records of the 7-day experiment. Henderson stood, his predatory calm finally shattering. Agent, you're just in time. These two have admitted to a fraudulent marriage to hide corporate malfeasance. Arrest them. The suspense was suffocating. Elena stepped forward, her hand steady as she held out the digital drive from the safe house. Agent Miller, we aren't the ones you're looking for. My father's embezzlement was a cover for a systematic siphon created by Mr. Henderson using a shadow trust. We have the decrypted logs. We have the proof that the experiment was a distraction to finalize the theft. The conflict reached its boiling point. Henderson lunged for the drive, but Jack stepped in, his larger frame blocking the older man with a cold, protective fury. The game is over, Henderson. You used our parents' grief as a weapon, but you forgot one thing, we aren't them. Agent Miller took the drive and plugged it into the main monitor. The room watched in stunned silence as the screen filled with a map of offshore accounts. It showed that Henderson hadn't just been following a dead man's orders, he had been funneling the firm's liquid assets into a private account in the Cayman Islands for years. The poison pill clause wasn't just a legal trap, it was the final authorization Henderson needed to transfer the remaining billions. The reckoning was swift. Miller turned to Henderson, whose face had gone from gray to a ghostly, translucent white. Arthur Henderson, you're under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and witness tampering. As the handcuffs clicked around Henderson's wrists, he looked at Jack and Elena with a look of pure, concentrated venom. You think you've won? You've destroyed the firms. By exposing the fraud, you've tanked the stock. You have each other, but you have nothing else. We have exactly what we need, Jack said, his voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the room. The tragedy of the collapse was real. The stock tickers on the wall were a sea of red, plummeting as the news of the arrest hit the wires. But as the chaos erupted, reporters clamoring at the glass walls and shareholders screaming, Jack turned to Elena. In the middle of the wreckage of their family's empires, he took her hand. The forced marriage was a hollow term now. They were standing in the ruins of their old lives, facing potential bankruptcy and a mountain of legal paperwork, but for the first time in 10 years, they were breathing clean air. "We need to get out of here," Elena whispered, looking at the sirens flashing on the street below. "We're going back to Newport," Jack said, a faint, determined smile touching his lips. "But this time, we're burning the list of expectations." Walking out of the building, heads held high, ignored by the cameras that were too busy filming Henderson's perp walk. They had lost the kingdom, but they had won the war. Now, all that was left was the resolution of a decade-long ache. Chapter 10, The Resolution and Happily Ever After. 6 months later, the Newport estate no longer felt like a stone fortress or a graveyard. The heavy ivy had been trimmed back to let in the Rhode Island sun, and the salt spray against the windows sounded like a celebration rather than a warning. The legal battle had been grueling. Jack and Elena had stayed true to their word. They dismantled the old, corrupt structures of Harrison Vane and rebuilt from the ground up. They were no longer the heirs to a dark legacy. They were the founders of Vance Harrison Global, a firm built on the transparency their parents had been too afraid to embrace. They weren't as wealthy as they once were, but for the first time, every cent they owned was theirs. Jack stood on the cliffside balcony where day one had begun. He was dressed casually, the sharp lines of his corporate armor replaced by a man at peace. He felt Elena's presence before he heard her. She stepped out beside him, looking radiant in a white sundress, her midnight hair caught in the breeze. "The final audit came back," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Henderson's assets have been fully seized. The docks are safe, and the firm is stable. We did it, Jack." Jack turned to her, his amber eyes soft. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring. Not the heavy, traditional diamond of a forced merger, but a simple, elegant band of emerald and gold. "The first marriage was an experiment," Jack said, his voice dropping to that intimate, gravelly rasp. "It was for the lawyers, for the board, and for the ghosts. But I don't want to live in an experiment anymore. I want to live in a choice. Elena Vance, would you do me the honor of marrying me, for real this time?" Elena laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that finally chased the last of the silence from the estate. 7 days wasn't enough, was it? "Not even close," Jack whispered. "I want 70 years. "Then yes," she replied, sliding the ring onto her finger. 1,000 times, yes." They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of fire and rose. The forbidden labels, the tragic secrets, and the conflicting legacies were gone. In their place was a love that had been tested in the dark and found to be unbreakable. The experiment was over, and the real life of Jack and Elena had finally begun. Thank you for listening. We hope this journey of suspense, tragedy, and ultimate triumph has captured your heart as much as it did ours. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think Jack and Elena were right to give up the empire for each other? Or was Henderson right about the liability of their love? Drop a comment below and let's discuss. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our next sweet and steamy audiobook release. Until next time, remember that sometimes, the best things in life are the ones we're forced to find.